Imagine for a second you're a young soldier, right? And it's Christmas Eve, 1914.
Okay.
You're huddled in a trench,
Mm-hmm.
freezing cold mud everywhere,
Yeah.
and across no man's land you see the enemy,
Right.
the faces you've been trained to hate,
Yeah.
but then you hear something completely unexpected.
Okay.
They're singing Christmas carols.
It's one of the most remarkable stories from World War One.
It is.
This spontaneous moment of peace in the middle of unimaginable brutality.
The Christmas Truce of 1914. We're going to deep dive into that today.
Yeah.
Using firsthand accounts, historical analysis, try to understand how something so incredible could happen and what it means for us today, all these years later.
Absolutely. We're going to start by setting the scene.
Okay.
December 1914.
Okay.
The Western Front is just brutal.
Yeah.
A network of trenches that stretch across Europe. The Battle of Ypres has just ended, leaving a devastating toll on both sides.
Tens of thousands dead, right?
That's right.
And this is just a few months into the war. Everyone thought it would be over by Christmas.
Right, that initial optimism was gone. The reality had set in that this was going to be a long and bloody conflict.
Yeah, so in this bleak and brutal landscape, we find the London Rifle Brigade.
Oh.
They're stationed in Plug Street Wood in Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
They've suffered a terrible loss that makes this Christmas Eve especially poignant.
Yes, one of their own, a soldier named Bassingham, known for his beautiful singing voice, was killed by a sniper just days before Christmas.
Wow.
Imagine the weight of that loss hanging over the men, even as they try to find some flicker of holiday cheer.
Yeah, it really emphasizes the constant danger these men lived with every day.
Mm-hmm.
Even Christmas couldn't provide a true escape from the threat of death.
That's right, and the military leaders on both sides, they actually forbid any kind of fraternization.
Really?
They were afraid that it would undermine the war effort.
Interesting.
Even the new Pope Benedict XVI had called for a Christmas truce, and his plea was ignored.
Wow. So bottom line, no one wanted this to happen.
No, they didn't.
Yeah.
But down in the trenches, something remarkable was about to unfold.
So let's go down into the trenches then.
Let's do it.
It's late on Christmas Eve,
Mm-hmm.
and Rifleman Graham Williams is on sentry duty,
Okay.
peering out into the darkness of no man's land. It's freezing cold, desolate, just a scene of utter despair.
Yes, he later wrote about how lonely and hopeless he felt,
Right?
standing watch on Christmas Eve so far from home.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
And then he sees something completely unexpected.
Okay.
He sees lights flickering in the German trenches across the way.
Light, what kind of lights?
Candles, they placed candles on these small makeshift Christmas trees.
Wow.
And then he hears singing.
No way.
The Germans are singing Still Nacht.
Silent Night.
Yes, and that wasn't a well-known carol among the British at the time.
Can you imagine the shock hearing those notes of hope and peace coming from the enemy lines?
It must have been incredible. Williams said he was stunned. He almost couldn't believe it.
Wow.
But then, as if in response, the British soldiers started singing the first Noel.
I get chills just thinking about that moment.
Me too.
And then they both start singing, "O come all ye faithful,"
Together.
which is Adeste Fidelis in Latin.
That's right. So they're using this shared language.
Right.
The music transcends the barbed wire and the trenches. It must have been an incredible moment.
A true testament to the power of music and the common ground it can forge,
Absolutely.
even between enemies.
Even between enemies. And it's important to note, this wasn't some organized event
Yeah.
planned by the commanders. This was spontaneous.
Coming from the soldiers themselves.
Exactly. It was a true eruption of peace.
And it wasn't limited to Plug Street Wood, was it?
No, it wasn't. There are reports from all across the Western Front of similar truces breaking out.
So like these little pockets of humanity in the midst of a global war?
Yeah, it wasn't a widespread, coordinated ceasefire.
Right.
But these localized moments of peace were remarkable.
Okay, so how did these truces actually happen? I mean, what did the soldiers do when they met in no man's land?
Well, the accounts vary, but there are some common threads.
Okay.
One of the most common acts was burying the dead.
Right. The stench of decomposing bodies was overwhelming, and the truce provided a chance to give these fallen soldiers a proper burial.
It's a grim task.
It is.
But I imagine it also required a lot of trust on both sides.
Absolutely. You have to remember, just hours before these men were trying to kill each other,
Right.
and now they're working side by side, united in this common act of respect.
It really challenges our perception of war. We tend to think of it in these black and white terms, us versus them, good versus evil.
Right.
But the Christmas truce shows us a different reality.
It does, a reality where common humanity can exist even in the most brutal circumstances.
So they buried the dead. What else? What other interactions took place during these truces?
Well, there are stories of soldiers sharing food and cigarettes,
Okay.
helping each other repair trenches,
Wow.
even exchanging gifts.
Like what?
Small tokens of friendship like buttons or badges,
Wow.
swapped between men who just hours before had been shooting at each other.
It's hard to even imagine that.
It is this glimpse of normalcy, of camaraderie, right in the heart of a war zone.
One of the most striking examples is this story of a soccer match
A soccer match.
played between British and German soldiers in no man's land.
That's incredible. Do we have any details on that?
We do. Ernie Williams of the 6th Battalion Cheshire Regiment left a really vivid account of the game.
And Ernie was right there in the thick of it. Wasn't he quite young at the time?
He was only 19 years old,
Wow.
and his account, even decades later, just crackles with this excitement of that day.
I bet.
He describes how astonished he was when the Germans produced a soccer ball seemingly out of thin air.
Wow.
Hundreds of soldiers from both sides ended up participating in this impromptu match.
So a soccer match in no man's land. That's a really powerful image, isn't it?
It is.
Testament to the human need for connection, even when facing incredible adversity.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just Ernie.
Mm.
There are numerous accounts of this type of interaction up and down the front lines.
Like what?
French and German troops swapping champagne and cigarettes.
British and German soldiers singing carols together,
Wow.
sharing photos of loved ones back home.
So these weren't just isolated cases. It seems like there was a genuine desire for connection, a yearning for this moment of peace.
Yes, shared by soldiers on both sides.
It makes you wonder what compels people to take such risks to reach across the divide even when they've been told not to. What do you think drove these soldiers to disobey orders and risk their lives for these moments of peace?
That's a great question, and it's something historians have grappled with for years.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer, but I think it speaks to something fundamental about the human spirit.
What's that?
This need for connection, for compassion, for hope.
And it reminds us that even in the darkest of times, those impulses can still come through.
Exactly. The Christmas truce wasn't about surrendering or betraying one's country.
Right.
It was about recognizing a shared humanity, however fleetingly,
Yeah.
and choosing to act on that recognition.
This has been an incredible start to our deep dive.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's even more to explore.
But before we continue, I think we need to take a moment to reflect on what we've learned so far.
Okay.
What are some of the key takeaways that have stood out to you?
Well, for me, it's the reminder that peace is always a possibility, even in the most unlikely of circumstances.
Okay.
And that these moments of peace often arise not from grand political gestures,
Yeah.
but from the individual choices of ordinary people.
I think that's a powerful insight.
It is.
It reminds us that we all have a role to play in building a more peaceful world.
We do. You know, as we dive deeper into these stories from the Christmas truce,
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that this wasn't a universally embraced phenomenon.
Right. Of course, it's easy to get caught up in the warm and fuzzy stuff, but I'm sure not everyone felt that way.
No, absolutely not. For some soldiers, this truce was a betrayal, a
Yeah.
violation of their duty.
Wow.
They saw it as undermining the war effort,
Right.
giving the enemy an advantage.
I guess that makes sense given the intensity of the fighting the propaganda, demonizing the other side.
Exactly. And there were concerns that this fraternization would weaken morale, make it harder to go back to fighting.
Right.
There were even rumors of soldiers being punished for participating in the truce, although those are difficult to verify.
Yeah, it's a good reminder of how complex war really is
It is.
and how difficult it is to reconcile these moments of humanity with the larger, political and ideological forces at play.
Exactly. But even for those who opposed the truce, its impact was undeniable.
In what way?
It challenged their assumptions about the enemy.
Okay.
It forced them to confront the reality that those on the other side were human beings too.
And for the men who did participate, it was an experience that stayed with them long after the war ended.
It did.
A lot of them wrote about it in their letters and diaries, these really vivid accounts that give us a glimpse into what it must have been like to be there in the trenches
Yes.
on that extraordinary Christmas day.
These firsthand accounts are so valuable, they really transport us back to that moment. They allow us to experience the truce through the eyes of those who are there.
And it's interesting how the truces varied from place to place.
Right.
Some lasted just a few hours, others went on for days, even weeks.
Yeah, in some areas it was just a brief exchange of greetings and carols.
Okay.
In other areas there was more expensive interaction, like sharing food, playing games, even attending joint religious services.
There's a story about a British chaplain holding a Christmas service in no man's land with soldiers from both sides attending.
Wow.
Can you imagine that?
That's amazing.
A moment of shared faith amidst the wreckage of war.
It really speaks to the universality of certain human experiences, the
Yeah.
things that transcend national boundaries and political ideologies.
We talked earlier about that famous soccer match that took place.
We did.
Are there any other accounts that stand out to you, stories that really capture the spirit of the truce?
Well, there's the story of this German soldier who wandered into the British trenches on Christmas Day simply to ask for a cup of tea. He was welcomed, offered food and conversation, and then escorted back to his own lines unharmed.
It's like something out of a movie.
I know, it's almost too unbelievable to be true.
Right.
And yet there are multiple accounts of this kind of simple human interaction taking place during the truce.
Wow.
It just highlights the absurdity of the situation.
Yeah.
These men trained to kill each other, suddenly sharing a cup of tea and a bit of conversation.
It's a stark reminder of that disconnect between the political realities of war and the individual experiences of the soldiers on the ground.
Exactly, and it raises the question.
You bet.
If these moments of peace and understanding were possible even for a short time, what does that tell us about the potential for lasting peace?
It's a question that has haunted historians and peace activists for over a century,
It has.
and there are no easy answers.
No, but the Christmas truce offers us a glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even amidst the horrors of war, the human spirit can still shine through.
And that even the most bitter enemies can find common ground if only for a moment.
Exactly, but what happened after the truce?
Yeah, what happened?
Did those feelings of camaraderie, those bonds of shared humanity, did they last?
I'm guessing not.
Sadly, no. In most cases, the truces were just a brief interlude
Right.
as the holidays passed and the reality of war set back in the fighting resumed.
It's heartbreaking to think about those moments of hope and connection just extinguished by the relentless machinery of war.
It is, and as the war dragged on,
Right.
becoming even more brutal and destructive, the Christmas truces came to be seen as an anomaly,
Right.
this fleeting moment of idealism that could never be replicated.
But even though the truce was temporary,
Yeah.
its impact was lasting.
Absolutely. The story of the Christmas truce has resonated through the decades, inspiring artists, writers, filmmakers. It's become a symbol of hope, a reminder that peace is always possible, even in the most unlikely of circumstances.
And it continues to challenge us
It does.
to think differently about conflict, to consider the human cost of war, and to seek out opportunities for peace and reconciliation, even when they seem impossible.
Precisely, the Christmas truce reminds us that we have a choice to succumb to the forces of division and hatred,
Right.
or to embrace our shared humanity and work towards a more peaceful world.
Those are powerful words,
They are.
and they lead us perfectly into the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll explore the legacy of the Christmas truce
Right.
and discuss what lessons we can learn from this extraordinary event. Lessons that are perhaps even more relevant today than they were a century ago. So we spent this whole episode talking about this just amazing event,
We have.
this eruption of humanity in the middle of one of the most brutal wars in history.
Right.
As we kind of wrap up our deep dive into the Christmas truce, what are your final thoughts on its legacy?
Well, I think it's clear that the Christmas truce still fascinates us
It does.
over a century later. I mean, it's become almost this mythical tale woven into our collective memory. Why do you think that is? What is it about this event that continues to captivate us?
Well, on one level, it's just a really compelling story, right?
Really?
You have these young men trapped in these horrific conditions.
Yeah.
And they choose, even for a brief time, to lay down their arms and connect as human beings.
Right.
It's a story of defiance,
Yeah.
of compassion, hope in the face of despair.
Right. And it's such a visual story, too.
It is.
You can picture those flickering candles in the trenches,
Mm-hmm.
the soldiers sharing cigarettes, kicking a soccer ball across this frozen mud.
Yeah,
It's almost cinematic.
it is. And those images, they've been captured, amplified through art, literature, and film.
Absolutely.
The Christmas truce has become this enduring symbol
Yeah.
representing this deep yearning for peace that I think resonates with all of us.
Yeah.
But it's more than just a feel-good story, right?
Sure.
I mean, it has real implications for how we think about war and peace.
It does. The Christmas truce challenges our assumptions about the enemy. It reminds us that even in the midst of conflict, we're dealing with human beings.
Right.
Individuals with families, hopes, and fears, just like our own.
It forces us to confront those gray areas
Right.
that exist beyond the simple narratives of good versus evil,
Right.
and it demonstrates that even in the most entrenched conflicts, those moments of peace and understanding are still possible.
Absolutely. The Christmas truce wasn't about surrendering or betraying one's country.
Right.
It was about recognizing a shared humanity.
Yeah.
And for a brief time, choosing to act on that recognition, it was a choice made by individuals,
Right.
not governments or military leaders.
It's a powerful reminder that we always have a choice.
Yeah.
Even when it feels like all hope is lost, we can choose to perpetuate violence,
Yeah.
or we can choose to seek out those moments of connection, those opportunities for peace.
And it starts with small acts,
Okay.
small choices that we make in our everyday lives. It's about listening to those who hold different views, seeking common ground, recognizing our shared humanity even in the face of difference.
If soldiers in the trenches of World War I could find a way to connect with their so-called enemies,
Right.
surely we can find ways to do the same in our own lives.
Absolutely.
It's a challenge, no doubt. But I think the Christmas truce offers us a reason for hope.
It does.
It's a reminder that peace isn't some unattainable dream.
Right.
It's a choice that we can make, each and every one of us, every single day.
It's a legacy worth reflecting on,
It is.
especially as we navigate, the complexities and divisions of our own world.
Yeah.
The Christmas truce reminds us that amidst the darkness, there is always the possibility for light, for hope, for peace.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Christmas truce of 1914.
Of course.
We'll be back next week with another fascinating story from history.